The morning Martha Bristol found a stranger crouched at her gate with a hammer in his hand and sawdust on his boots. She had not spoken a single unnecessary word to another human being in 11 months, 2 weeks and 4 days. She stood at the kitchen window with her coffee mug pressed warm against both palms, watching him through the wavy glass as the pale September light of 1882 broke over the red hills of New Mexico territory. He was working with a kind of focused quiet that she recognized, not the nervous quiet of a man who feared being caught, but the steady quiet of someone who simply believed the work needed doing. He measured twice before he cut. He used his level. He tapped the nails in with the kind of careful patience that made her think he was not in any particular hurry to be anywhere else in the world. Martha set her mug down on the pine counter and folded her arms across her chest. She had not asked for this. She had not asked for anything from anyone since the day they put Thomas in the ground on the east ridge of their 40 acres, beneath the juniper tree he had always liked best, because its roots kept the soil from washing away in the summer storms. She had not asked her neighbors to bring food, though they had. She had not asked her brother-in-law Raymond to manage the cattle contracts, though he had offered 3 times. She had not asked anyone for a single thing, and that silence, that fierce, self-reliant silence, had become the architecture of her life out here. It held everything up. It kept the walls from falling in. And yet here was a man at her gate with a hammer. She turned away from the window and poured a second mug of coffee. Then she stopped. She looked at the mug in her hand, then at the window, then back at the mug. Something in her that she did not entirely trust made her pour the second mug before she could talk herself out of it. She pushed open the back door and walked across the yard. The man did not hear her coming until she was close enough to see that he was younger than she had guessed from the window, somewhere in his early 30s, with sun-dark skin and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days. His hat was a weathered brown with a crease along the crown that looked like it had been sat on more than once. He was replacing the bottom rail of the gate, the one that had rotted through over the summer rains and dragged in the dirt every time she opened it, which she had been managing perfectly well by lifting it at the corner before swinging it, and she had been doing that for 7 months without complaint. He looked up when her shadow crossed him, and his expression shifted from concentration to something cautious and polite. "Ma'am," he said, and touched the brim of his hat. "I did not ask you to do that," Martha said. He looked at the gate, then back at her. "No, ma'am, you did not." "Then what are you doing on my property?" He set the hammer down on the post and straightened up. He was tall, an inch or 2 over 6 feet, with the kind of lean build that came from years of hard work rather than anything deliberate. His eyes were a clear dark brown, and there was something in them that was direct without being aggressive. "My name is Jasper Kendrick," he said. "I came through on the Mora Road 2 days ago, and I've been camped down by the creek bend on the Hadley parcel. Nobody's using it." He said this last part in a way that suggested he knew it might be questioned and had already prepared his answer. "I saw your gate dragging when I rode past yesterday. Figured you might want it fixed." "Figured," Martha said flatly. "Yes, ma'am." "Without asking. You didn't look like you wanted to be asked." Martha stared at him for a long moment. The wind moved through the dry grass along the fence line with a sound like paper being turned. A roadrunner shot across the far end of the yard and disappeared into the scrub. She held out the second mug. He looked at it. Something moved across his face, surprise, and then something softer beneath it. "Thank you," he said, and took it with both hands the way a man takes something he knows is being offered carefully. She turned around and walked back to the house without saying anything else. She did not invite him in. She did not introduce herself. She went back to the kitchen and stood at the window and drank her coffee and watched him finish the work. He took 40 minutes. When he was done, he opened and closed the gate twice to test it, made one small adjustment to the latch with a pair of pliers he pulled from his belt, and then he set the empty mug on the post, touched his hat brim in the direction of the house, collected his tools, and rode away down the Mora Road on a sorrel horse the color of dry brick. Martha watched him go. She did not move from the window for a long time after the dust had settled. Then she washed both mugs. She told herself she would not think about him again. She was not, as it turned out, particularly good at keeping that promise. The days in September had a particular quality out in that part of New Mexico territory that could break you open if you let them. The light came in amber and low. The mountains turned a color that was somewhere between purple and gray at dusk, and the evenings were cold enough that you needed a fire but not so cold that it felt like punishment. Thomas had loved September. He had always said it was the only honest month, because it did not pretend to be warmer than it was or cooler than it was, and the days were exactly as long as they needed to be. Martha had 400 acres, which she had been managing alone since Thomas died of a fever in October of the previous year. She had 31 head of cattle, 6 horses, 2 mules, a kitchen garden, and a root cellar she had dug herself in June because the one Thomas built had flooded in the spring thaw, and she had not had the patience to wait for someone else to do it. She had a neighbor named Clara Whitfield who lived 3 miles east and who came by every 2 weeks or so with pies that Martha always accepted and sometimes even ate. She had a hired hand named Pedro Gutierrez who came 3 days a week to help with the livestock and the heavier field work, and she paid him fair wages that he deserved, and she knew it. She had a ranch that was hers in every way that mattered, and she was not drowning, and she was not lost, and she was not waiting for anyone to rescue her. She was just lonely. That was the part she did not say out loud. Not to Clara, not to Pedro, not to the letter she wrote to her sister in Missouri every other month. She had not said it out loud because saying it felt like weakness, and she had been careful since Thomas not to let herself be weak. Weakness was a gap in the fence line, and the whole herd would go through it. But the truth was that the evenings were long and the house was very quiet, and she had started talking to the horses more than was strictly necessary. So when Jasper Kendrick appeared at her gate again 2 mornings later, she was more relieved than she was irritated, and she was not pleased with herself about that. He did not have tools this time. He was just there at the fence line when she came out to the yard, sitting easy on his sorrel horse, hat in his hands. He had shaved. She noticed that in spite of herself. "I was not expecting company," Martha said. "I know that," Jasper said. "I'm not exactly offering company. I was wondering if you might need help with anything else on the property. I noticed the chicken wire on the north side looks like it might have had a run-in with a coyote." "It did," Martha said, 3 weeks ago. "I patched it. I saw that. The patch is holding fine." He turned his hat in his hands. "I've got nothing particularly pressing for the next few weeks. I'm good with fences and livestock and general repairs. I'm not asking for charity work. I'd want fair wages for fair work, and I'll sleep in the barn if you've got space." Martha looked at him for a long moment. The morning light was full now, and it caught the dust on his hat and made everything look very clear and very still. "Why?" she said. "Why what? Why are you here? Why my property? There's 4 ranches between here and Cimarron, at least 2 of them are bigger than mine. Why is a man with your apparent skill set camped on an empty parcel and fixing strangers' gates without permission?" Something changed in his expression. Not evasion exactly, but something careful. He looked out toward the eastern ridge for a moment, then back at her. "I've been riding for a long time," he said simply. "I was foreman on the Dunbar spread up in Colorado for 4 years, and then the family sold, and I've been drifting since spring. Not because I have to. I've got money enough to get me a good while, but because I've been trying to figure out where I want to put down, and I thought riding around looking at things might help me figure it out." He paused. "I rode past your place 3 times on the Mora Road before I stopped. Something about it looked like it needed attention but not rescue, if that makes any sense." Martha was quiet for a moment. "Attention but not rescue," she repeated. "Yes, ma'am. My name is Martha Bristol." "I know," he said. "I asked at the trading post in Rialto." She almost smiled at that. She pressed her mouth flat before it could become one. "Come around to the barn. I'll show you what needs doing. Wages are $2 a day, and you can sleep in the loft if you don't snore." "I don't snore," Jasper said, and there was something at the edge of his voice that was not quite a smile either, but was close to one. He was useful, she discovered. Genuinely, practically useful in ways that were not showy and did not require admiration. He found the weak spot in the east pasture fence that she had been meaning to check since July, and fixed it without mentioning it to her until it was done. He noticed that 2 of her horses had thrush coming on in their front hooves, and treated it properly with the right supplies from the trading post in Rialto, which he rode out to get himself without asking for the money first. He repaired the latch on the root cellar and rehung the barn door that had been dragging since spring, and he did all of this with a steady, unhurried competence that she found, against her better judgment, deeply reassuring. He was also careful with her space. He did not come to the house unless she invited him to. He ate his meals mostly at the barn or in the open, though she began leaving a plate out for him on the porch railing at supper time after the 3rd day, because she was making food anyway and it was wasteful not to. He did not talk more than the work required, but when he did talk, he said things that were worth listening to. On the 5th evening, she came out to check on the horses before bed and found him sitting on the fence rail at the edge of the far pasture, watching the sky go dark over the mountains. She could have turned around. She stood there for a moment, and then she walked over and stood beside the fence. "Thomas," she said, without entirely planning to say it, "used to say September evenings out here made everything else in the world seem like it was probably going to be all right." Jasper was quiet for a moment. "Was Thomas your husband?" "Yes." She put her hands in the pockets of her work coat. "He died last October, fever. It went through fast." She said it the way she had learned to say it, clean and flat, not inviting sympathy but not shutting the door all the way either. "I'm sorry," Jasper said, and he said it the way that meant he actually was, without the performance of grief that people sometimes gave her, the head tilting and the hand patting that made her want to step backward. "Were you ever married?" she asked. "No." He was looking at the mountains. "I was close once, about 6 years ago. Girl named Ana Lees in Pueblo. She was a good woman. We were going in that direction and then she got a better offer from a banker's son in Denver and she took it." He paused. "I don't blame her. She was right too. He could give her a life I couldn't at the time." "That's a generous way to remember it," Martha said. "It's just the true way." He looked at her briefly, then back at the sky. "I was not in a place then to give a woman what she deserved. I've been working on that since." Martha was quiet. The first stars were appearing, faint and far, and the air smelled like cooling dust and sage. "How old are you?" she asked. 32, he said. "You?" 34. She said it without hesitation. She had never been the kind of woman to be shy about her age. "Thomas was 37 when he died. We had been married 9 years. Any children?" "No, a beat. We tried, it did not happen." I made my peace with it. She said the last part a little too quickly and they both heard it. Jasper did not press. He just nodded and looked at the mountains, and the silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence you could sit in without having to do anything about it. After a while she said good night and went back to the house. She lay in the dark for a long time listening to the coyotes out on the mesa, and thinking about a woman named Ana Lees in Denver who had made the sensible choice. By the end of the 2nd week, Pedro Gutierrez had decided he approved of Jasper Kendrick, which Martha knew because Pedro stopped referring to him as "that man from the barn" and started calling him by his name. Pedro was 41 years old and had been working on ranches in New Mexico territory since he was 16, and he had very clear opinions about what made a man worth knowing. His primary criteria were: did the man do his work without complaining? Did he treat the horses well? And did he deal honestly with people regardless of who they were? Jasper passed all 3 tests within the first week and a half. He also, on a Tuesday morning, when a man from the Darrow Land Company arrived at the property in a buggy with a surveying rod and an attitude of absolute confidence, handled the situation in a way that Martha found herself replaying later in more detail than was probably necessary. The man's name was Gerald Pitt, and he had a mustache that seemed to be trying to compensate for something. And he arrived without any prior notice, and without removing his hat when he spoke to Martha, which told her everything she needed to know about his intentions before he opened his mouth. He told her that the Darrow Land Company had acquired the Hadley parcel to the west and was in the process of surveying the surrounding land for potential consolidation opportunities. He used the word consolidation 4 times in 5 minutes. He then told her, with the tone of a man who believed he was being generous, that the company was prepared to offer her a fair price for the property given its current condition. Martha listened to all of this with her arms folded. "The property's current condition," she said, "is excellent, and it's not for sale." Gerald Pitt smiled in a way that managed to be both patient and condescending at the same time, a considerable achievement. "Mrs. Bristol, running a spread of this size alone can be a considerable challenge. The company is prepared to offer. She said it's not for sale." Jasper had come around the corner of the barn with a fence post under one arm and a completely neutral expression. He stopped a few feet away from the buggy and looked at Gerald Pitt with the flat, unhurried attention of a man who has absolutely nowhere to be and nothing to prove. "I was speaking with Mrs. Bristol," Gerald Pitt said. "I know you were," Jasper said pleasantly. "She gave you her answer." The two men looked at each other for a moment. Gerald Pitt was not a small man, but there was something in the quality of Jasper's stillness that made the space around him seem larger than his actual size. It was not a threat exactly. It was just a kind of absolute certainty that occupied its ground. Gerald Pitt looked at Martha. Martha looked back at him with an expression that gave him no ground whatsoever. He got back in his buggy. "The offer will remain open," he said. "Good day to you," Martha said. When the buggy had disappeared down the road, Martha turned to Jasper. He had already gone back to carrying the fence post to where it needed to go. She watched him for a moment. "I had that handled," she said. "I know you did," he said without looking up. "You didn't need to step in." He set the fence post down and looked at her. "Would you have rather I hadn't?" She thought about it honestly. "No," she said, "but I want you to know that I would have." "I never doubted it for a single second," Jasper said, and the way he said it made it perfectly clear that he meant it. That afternoon she made a pot of beef stew and brought 2 bowls out to the porch. She called him in from the barn and they ate together at the small table on the porch where she sometimes took her meals in good weather. And for the first time since Thomas, she did not eat alone and did not wish she was. They talked about the land company while they ate. Jasper knew of the Darrow Land Company. He had seen their work in Colorado, where they had bought out 3 mid-sized ranches in succession and combined them into a single operation that ran cattle on an industrial scale and treated the land with the indifference of people who planned to take as much as possible and then move on. He said this calmly and factually and without dramatics, and Martha appreciated the clarity of it. "They'll be back," she said. "Probably," Jasper agreed. This land belonged to Thomas's family before it was ours. His father built the original structure before statehood was even a conversation. "I will not sell it to a company that will run it into the ground and move on," Jasper nodded. "Then you'll need to make sure everything's in order. Survey your property lines properly. Keep up with the land office filings. Make sure there's no gap they can drive a legal argument through. Raymond, my brother-in-law, he handled a lot of the paperwork after Thomas died. I've been meaning to go through it myself, but I haven't had the time." "Make time," Jasper said. "I can take over here for a few days if you need to ride into Cimarron." She looked at him. "You've only been here 2 weeks." "Long enough to know the property," he said simply. She did go to Cimarron 3 days later. She spent 2 full days at the county land office going through the records with a thoroughness that the clerk, a young man named Fowler, found slightly unnerving. She found 2 minor discrepancies in the survey records from 1876 that she had corrected with affidavits before she left. She also filed an updated deed of sole ownership that she should have filed the previous November and had simply not gotten to. When she rode back home at the end of the second day, it was dusk and the mountains were purple, and the first lamps were lit in the window of the house. She had not left anyone in the house before. She had left Jasper to manage the property, and he had done that, and when she rode into the yard, the horses were fed and the barn was closed up properly and there was a light in the kitchen. She went inside and found that he had left a pot of something on the stove, still warm. There was a note on the table in a handwriting she had not seen before, large and careful letters that looked like someone who had taught himself. Cattle all in. Fed your gray separately. She was favoring her left foreleg. Looks like a stone bruise. Nothing serious. Left you supper. J.K. Martha stood in her own kitchen holding the note and feeling something she had no good name for. She ate the supper, which turned out to be beans and cornbread, and then she sat at the table for a long time with her hands around a cup of coffee and the note still on the table in front of her, and she let herself feel the thing she did not have a good name for until she was able to put a name to it. It was comfort. It was the specific, particular comfort of being known well enough to be cared for without being asked. Thomas had known her that way. She had not expected to feel it again. She folded the note carefully and put it in the drawer with the things she kept. In the weeks that followed, a kind of rhythm developed between them that Martha had not designed and could not entirely explain. She would not have called it courtship, because neither of them did anything so deliberate as court. But it had a quality of its own, a building warmth between two people who were both very careful and both very aware. Jasper Kendrick was not a forward man. He did not press. He did not suggest more than he offered. But he was present in a way that accumulated over time, like the slow filling of a dry well. You did not notice each individual drop, but eventually you looked down and there was water. She noticed the way he listened when she talked about the ranch. Not the polite listening of someone waiting for their turn to speak, but actual listening, where he remembered things from one conversation and referenced them in another. She had explained the grazing rotation she had worked out after Thomas died, a system she had developed herself over 8 months of trial and error. And 2 weeks later, when she was considering moving the herd to the north pasture, he had said, "Didn't you say the grass there comes back thin after the second week?" And she had looked at him and felt a small, exact warmth in her chest. She noticed the way he was with the horses, particularly with her gray mare, whose name was November and who was difficult with strangers as a general rule. November had taken to Jasper by the end of the first week, which was unprecedented. Martha had watched him with November on a Tuesday afternoon, standing very still in the paddock and letting the mare come to him in her own time, not reaching for her, just being there, and she had thought, "This is a man who understands that patience is a form of respect." She also noticed, though she tried not to, the way he looked at her when he thought she was not looking, not in a hungry way, in a considering way, as if she were a problem he was genuinely interested in solving, but was not sure he had the right to attempt. Clara Whitfield came by at the end of September with a pie and a barely concealed burning curiosity about the man in the barn. She sat at the kitchen table and drank coffee and said, in the tone of someone who believes they are being subtle, "So where did you say this Mr. Kendrick came from again?" "I didn't say," Martha said. "Colorado, I heard. The Dunbar spread." "News travels," Martha said. "Martha, I've known you for 6 years and I've never seen you let a stranger sleep in your barn." Clara wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. "I'm not asking because I'm nosy. Well, I am asking because I'm nosy, but I'm also asking because you seem different." "Different how?" Clara tilted her head. "Less like a house that's been shuttered for winter." Martha was quiet for a moment. Through the window she could see Jasper across the yard, working with Pedro to reseat a fence post that had heaved in the summer rains. "He's good with the property," she said. Clara said, in the tone of someone who feels they have made their point sufficiently. After Clara left, Martha stood at the window for a long time. The light in the afternoon was going gold and low, the way it did in late September, and the 2 men across the yard had finished with the post and were talking, Pedro gesturing and Jasper listening with his head slightly bent. and there was something about the ordinary domestic completeness of the scene that caught her somewhere between the ribs. She was not going to be foolish about this. She was 34 years old and she had buried one husband, and she knew better than anyone that feeling warmth toward a useful man in your barn was not the same as anything more serious. She was not going to make herself ridiculous by falling into something precipitous and regrettable. She picked up her coffee cup, found it empty, and refilled it. The 1st of October brought a cold snap that dropped the nights into the 20s and frosted the kitchen garden, which Martha had already harvested. It also brought a problem with the cattle, 2 of the cows showing signs of pink eye, which was not catastrophic but required attention and the right treatment and a certain amount of patience with animals that did not want to be handled. Jasper handled them. He also, on the 3rd day of the cold snap, appeared at the back door of the house in the early evening with a question about the tack room that required going inside to look at the inventory list she kept in the kitchen. And somehow by the time the question was answered, they were both sitting at the kitchen table with coffee, and the conversation had moved from the tack room to the cattle operation to the history of the Bristol ranch, to what Thomas had been like. She had not talked about Thomas to anyone who was not already Thomas's family or one of the handful of people who had known him in life. She found, surprising herself, that she wanted to talk about him to Jasper. He was a patient man, she said. More patient than I am, which I know is not saying a great deal. He was methodical. He kept records of everything: rainfall, grazing yields, cattle weights, prices. He had notebooks going back 15 years that I still refer to. She paused. He was funny when he wanted to be. He had a very dry sense of humor, and he almost never smiled when he was being funny, which made it funnier. Jasper was listening with his hands around his coffee cup. Did he know how capable you were? The question surprised her. She thought about it. He knew, she said carefully, that I was capable. I think he also had a tendency to step in front of things before I had to deal with them, which I appreciated at the time but perhaps did not serve me as well as his confidence would have. She looked at her coffee. When he died, I found out I could do more than either of us had tested. That's a hard way to find out, Jasper said. Yes, she said, but it's a finding out. He looked at her, and in the lamplight his expression was something that she would have described as earnest, if she had been describing it to someone, which she was not planning to do. I think you should know, he said, choosing his words with the careful deliberateness of a man who does not often say what he is about to say, that I came here for the work and I've been glad of the work, but I've stayed because— He stopped. He looked at his coffee. I've stayed longer than the work requires. Martha was very still. I'm aware of that, she said. I don't want to overstep, he said. I know you didn't ask for company. You've made that clear from the beginning and I respect it. You also fixed my gate without asking, she said. He looked up. And I brought you coffee anyway, she said, with a flatness that was not quite flatness, that was something else wearing flatness as a coat. A long silence. The lamp between them put warm yellow light on the table and the frost was working at the window glass and the house was very quiet around them. Mrs. Bristol, he said, and then stopped. My name is Martha, she said. He looked at her and there it was between them, open and unhidden, and she found that she was not frightened of it the way she had expected to be. She was frightened of many things, of the land company, of a bad winter, of losing the cattle to disease, of the slow loneliness of a life conducted entirely alone. But this particular thing between them at her kitchen table she was not frightened of. She was something more like ready, which also frightened her, but differently. I should, he said, and made a motion to stand. Don't, she said quietly. He stopped. It's a cold night, she said, with perfect practicality and a perfect awareness that practicality was not even slightly what she meant. Have another cup of coffee. He sat back down. She poured the coffee. They sat together at the table while the frost thickened on the window and talked for 2 more hours about Colorado and New Mexico, and about the way the land changed as you went north, about cattle and horses, and the economics of running a small operation against the tide of the big land companies, about books. which it turned out they both read when they could get them, about the night sky over the mountains which neither of them had ever quite stopped being astonished by. When he finally left, he paused at the back door and turned to say good night, and for a moment they were very close in the narrow space of the doorframe, and neither of them moved for one long breath. "Good night, Martha," he said. "Good night, Jasper," she said. She closed the door behind him and stood with her back against it in the dark kitchen for a full minute. Then she went to bed and slept better than she had in months. October moved through the property like a slow tide, carrying color down from the mountains and making the mornings sharp and clear. Jasper had made no further declarations. Martha had made no further invitations. But something had shifted in the air between them, legible to both of them if to no one else, a kind of open acknowledged possibility that did not demand immediate resolution. She began eating supper with him regularly. Not as employer and hired hand, those lines were still there in the daytime, in the way they talked about the work, but in the evenings they had a different grammar. She brought out 2 plates and they sat at the porch table, or, as the nights got colder, at the kitchen table, and the conversations moved through every available subject with the ease of 2 people who had decided, without saying so, to find out how much they had to say to each other. It was considerable. He told her about his childhood in western Texas, a hard childhood by most measures. His father had been a horse trader who was more interested in trading than in the horses or in the children they had at home, and his mother had been a quiet woman of great internal fortitude who had taught him to read from a Bible and 2 volumes of history that were the only books in the house. He had left at 17 to work cattle and had been working ever since, moving north and west, learning everything there was to know about horses and land and livestock, and the particular discipline of being reliable. She told him about growing up in Missouri, the youngest of 4 children in a family that had enough but not an excess of anything, a father who ran a dry goods store, and a mother who was a formidable woman who ran her household and 3 of the town's primary social institutions simultaneously, and made it look easy. She had come to New Mexico territory at 25 with Thomas, who had inherited the ranch from his father and had proposed to her 6 months after meeting her at a cousin's wedding in St. Louis, and she had said yes because she had recognized in him a steadiness that she knew was rare. "Were you in love with him?" Jasper asked one evening. He asked it carefully, not prurience but genuine wanting to understand. Martha considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "It was not the kind of love that made me lose my head. I've never been that kind of person. But it was very real and very solid, and it grew for 9 years without ever shrinking, and when he died it felt like—" She stopped. "Like a room in the house that I still walk into sometimes and then remember it's empty." Jasper nodded. He did not rush to fill the space. "I don't think," she said more quietly, "that a person only gets one room." He looked at her steadily. "No," he said, "I don't think so either." The Darrow Land Company came back in mid-October, this time with a different representative, a man named Holt, who was smoother than Gerald Pitt and had done his homework. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon when Jasper was out in the far pasture, and Martha was alone in the yard splitting wood, which she was doing with the methodical efficiency that she applied to most physical tasks. Holt dismounted and introduced himself politely, and then told her that the company had recently acquired the Kellerman parcel to the north and was in a position to offer her a substantially improved price for the Bristol ranch. He named the price. It was not a bad price. It was a good price, designed to seem generous enough that pride could not reasonably refuse it. Martha split another log. "No," she said. Holt explained, still politely, that the company's intention was to consolidate the valley operations and that her parcel was essentially the last piece. He suggested, very carefully, that operating as a solo concern against the background of the company's resources might become difficult over time. Martha set down her axe and looked at him directly. "Are you suggesting it might become difficult on its own, Or are you suggesting the company might make it difficult? Holt maintained his smile, which told her everything. Mr. Holt, she said, I've been running this property alone for a year. I've improved the land, maintained the cattle, repaired the structures, and filed every legal document correctly and on time. The Bristol Ranch is not a struggling concern that requires rescue. It is a functioning property with clear title and adequate resources, and it is not for sale to your company or to anyone else. If you return to this property again with an offer I did not invite, I'll be speaking to the county attorney. Holt held her gaze for a moment. Then he touched his hat brim and mounted his horse with perfect composure. When he had ridden away, Martha picked up the axe and split 3 more logs with a force that was probably more than strictly necessary. Jasper rode in from the pasture 40 minutes later and found her still at the woodpile. He took in the quantity of wood she had split and gave her a measured look. Someone came by, he said. The Darrow Land Company again, she said. A man named Holt. He suggested operating alone might become difficult. Jasper dismounted and tied his horse to the rail. He was quiet for a moment, thinking, threatening or just implying. Implying carefully, nothing I could take to a lawyer on its own. What would you like to do? She liked that he asked. She looked at the woodpile, which was now very well stocked, and then at the mountains. I'd like to write to the county attorney anyway, she said. Put it on record. And I'd like to find out what they paid for the Kellerman parcel and see if the survey matches what's on file at the land office. I can ride up to the Kellerman boundary tomorrow and look at the corner markers, Jasper said. See if they match the county records. I'd appreciate that, Martha said. He went and came back the following evening with a piece of paper on which he had sketched the positions of the boundary markers he had found, careful and precise. They matched the county records exactly. Whatever the Darrow Land Company was, they were not sloppy in their legal work. But Martha's property was airtight, and they both knew it, and after the letter to the county attorney was sent and received and acknowledged, the Darrow Land Company ceased its visits to the Bristol Ranch. Whether they had moved on to easier targets or were simply waiting, Martha could not say for certain. She filed the county attorney's response in the tin box, she kept her important papers in, and she told herself she would stay watchful, and she turned her attention back to the work of the ranch, which was, as always, considerable. November arrived with the first real snow, 6 inches overnight that turned the whole world white and still and beautiful and extremely inconvenient for livestock management. Jasper was up before dawn on the first snow morning, and Martha came out to find him already breaking ice on the water troughs, his breath misting in the gray light, working with the systematic efficiency that she had come to expect from him, and that she had come to, if she was honest, depend on. She brought him coffee, as she always did. He took it with both hands, and they stood side by side at the paddock fence drinking their coffee in the cold morning air, watching the snow blow off the top of the ridge in long white plumes. November, he said thoughtfully, looking at the ridge. The month or the mare, she said. He almost smiled. This was something between them now, the almost smiling, the very precise reading of the line between straight-faced and amused that they had developed over the weeks. Both, I think, he said. She looked at the mountains and the snow and the pale early sky, and she thought, I am happy. It was a quiet thought, matter of fact, not triumphant or surprised. Just a clear, simple statement of fact, the way the cold was a fact, or the snow was a fact, or the man standing beside her was a fact. She did not say it out loud, but she let herself think it, all the way through, without flinching. That evening, after the livestock were settled and the barn was secure and the last chores were done, they sat together at the kitchen table with the wood stove going and the snow coming down outside the window. He had a volume of Thoreau that he had borrowed from Clara Whitfield, who kept a small library of remarkable breadth for someone living 3 miles from the nearest town. Martha was reviewing the winter feed supply calculations. It was a deeply domestic scene, 2 people in a warm kitchen on a cold night with their respective quiet occupations, and it was so ordinary and so unutterably right that Martha sat with it for a moment before speaking. "Jasper," she said. He looked up from the book. "I want to ask you something and I want you to answer honestly." "I'll do my best," he said. She put down her papers and looked at him directly. "What are your plans, in terms of staying, leaving? What are you thinking about?" He put the book down slowly and looked at her with the same directness. "I'm thinking about whether you want me to stay," he said. "That's what I've been thinking about." "That's not an answer," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's the true answer." He paused. "I came here without plans, Martha. I've told you that. I've been riding without plans for months, looking for somewhere I wanted to be. I've found it." He looked at the table. "Whether I get to stay in it is a different question." Martha was quiet. The stove popped and settled. The snow outside the window was very white and very quiet. "You've been here nearly 2 months," she said. "Yes. You've been good for this property." "I hope so." "You've been—" She stopped. She started again. "You've been good for me, in practical ways and in ways that are not strictly practical." She said this with the kind of precision that was her way of being vulnerable without being unguarded, not opening a door carelessly but opening it deliberately and with full knowledge of what she was doing. "I don't say that lightly." Jasper looked at her, and his expression was very open, very careful, the way it was when he was thinking seriously about something. "Martha," he said quietly. "I am not easy to live alongside," she said, pressing on before she lost her nerve. "I know that. I'm stubborn and I have particular ways of doing things, and I've been alone long enough that my independence has developed sharp edges." "I know all of that," he said. "And I am 34 years old and I have spent a year burying my grief and learning to stand on my own, and I am not interested in a man who wants to take over what I've built." "I know that too," he said. "I've never tried to." "No," she said. "You haven't." She looked at him. "That is the point." A long beat, the fire in the stove, the snow at the window. "What are you saying?" he said very carefully. "I'm saying," she said with a steadiness that cost her something, "that if you wanted to stay, not as the hired hand, but as more than that, I would not be opposed." Jasper Kendrick looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his expression, not surprise, because she did not think he was entirely surprised, but something more like the relief of a man who has been holding a breath for a very long time. "Martha," he said, and his voice was different than she had heard it before, lower and unguarded. "I have been trying very hard not to say certain things to you because I was not sure you wanted them said." "Say them now," she said. He got up from his chair and came around the table, and she stood as he reached her, and he took her hands in both of his, the way you take something that matters. "I love you," he said. "It happened before I knew it was happening, and I know the timing is peculiar, and I know you're not a woman who wants sweeping gestures. But I am telling you because I believe you deserve the truth of it and because I would very much like to stay. Not as hired hand. As yours, if you'll have me." Martha looked at this man, his careful hands around hers, his dark, clear eyes, the snow at the window behind him, the lamp on the table, the whole ordinary, extraordinary scene of a life that had space in it still for something new. "I love you too," she said, and it came out with the same clean simplicity as a true thing said out loud, which was exactly what it was. "I have been trying not to for approximately 6 weeks." He laughed at that, a genuine laugh, and the sound of it in her kitchen was so warm and so right that she laughed too. And then he put his arms around her and she put hers around him, and they held each other in the fire-lit kitchen while the snow fell outside, and the horses stood warm in the barn, and everything in the world was, for this particular moment, exactly as it should be. He kissed her, and she kissed him back, and it was not the tentative kiss of two people who were not sure. It was the kiss of two people who had been absolutely sure for quite some time and were finally, sensibly, acting on it. She put her hand against his face and he covered it with his. They stood like that for a while. The stove popped. The snow fell. November the mare shifted in the barn across the yard and the sound came through faintly, familiar and comforting. Eventually she made more coffee, because she was always going to make more coffee, and they sat back down at the table, closer now, and talked until very late about what they were and what they wanted and how it would go. two practical people having a very practical and also very tender conversation about love. He asked her, sometime around midnight, whether she would marry him. He asked it simply and directly without embellishment, and she answered with the same simplicity. Yes, she would. When they were ready. Which they were not quite yet because she believed in being sure and being sure required time, but yes, the direction was that direction and they both understood it. He went back to the barn eventually because some things were not to be rushed, and she lay in her bed in the dark and listened to the snow and felt the weight and the warmth of the last few hours settle over her like a second blanket. She had not asked for company. She had brought him coffee anyway. The winter was a working winter, the way all winters on a ranch were working winters, with the cold demanding constant attention and the cattle requiring extra feed and the water troughs needing to be broken open every morning and the horses kept in more than usual. But the work was shared now, not split by obligation but joined by choice, and there was a difference in the quality of it that Martha felt every day. Pedro noticed the shift within about 48 hours and responded by simply becoming slightly warmer in his manner toward Jasper, a barely perceptible calibration that meant everything in the economy of Pedro's communication style. He also, on a Friday afternoon in late November, brought tamales from his wife, Lucia, who lived in Rayado, and set them on the porch with the remark that Lucia wanted to know if the couple would come to dinner on Sunday, which was the first time Pedro had used the word couple in relation to them out loud. Martha accepted the invitation with a composure she was slightly proud of. Lucia Gutierrez turned out to be a small, bright-eyed woman of 40 who had strong opinions about almost everything, cooked extraordinary food, and took an instant and comprehensive interest in Martha's happiness that was so warm and so genuine that Martha, who was not generally given to quick emotional openings, found herself liking her enormously within the first quarter hour. Lucia also had a way of looking at Jasper, and then at Martha, and then back at Jasper, with the expression of someone completing a satisfying mental calculation. And she did this several times during dinner and each time managed to find something extremely urgent to say to Pedro just afterward, which gave Martha and Jasper brief moments of relative privacy at the table, which Lucia absolutely intended, and Martha chose not to acknowledge because it was too kind to be embarrassing about. They rode home that evening under a sky so thick with stars that it looked like someone had spilled light across it. Their horses walked side by side on the road, breath misting in the cold air, and Jasper reached across and took her hand where it rested on the saddle horn, and she let him hold it all the way home. December was cold and clear. Clara Whitfield came for coffee and left 3 hours later having received more information than she had technically asked for but less than she had hoped for, and she responded by squeezing Martha's hand very tightly at the door and saying, "Good, good, good," 3 times, which was about as effusive as Clara got. Christmas Day, they spent at the Gutierrez house in Rayado with Pedro and Lucia and their 4 children. Jasper played the mouth harp after supper, which Martha had not known about, and the children demanded increasingly complicated songs, and he produced them with an ease that she found enormously endearing. She sat beside him on the bench and felt the warmth of the house and the warmth of the people in it, and the warmth of this specific man against her shoulder, and she thought, Thomas would have liked him. It was a thought that did not hurt the way she had half expected it to. It felt instead like one of Thomas's approvals, dry and quiet and meant. On the last day of December, they stood on the porch of the Bristol ranch in the cold midnight air and watched the new year come in over the mountains, 1883 arriving with an absolute stillness and a sky like the inside of a cathedral. "I'd like to ask you properly," Jasper said. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring that had belonged to his mother, a small plain gold band with a single turquoise stone that was the color of the New Mexico sky on a clear winter day. Martha looked at the ring, she looked at him. "Your mother's ring," she said. "She gave it to me when I left Texas," he said. "Told me to give it to someone worthy. I've been carrying it for 15 years." He turned it over in his fingers. "I'd say the time is right." Martha held out her hand. He put the ring on her finger. "Yes," she said, as simply and completely as she had ever said anything. He kissed her under the midnight sky while the new year settled over the mountains and the horses stirred in the barn and the stars did their patient, indifferent, magnificent work above it all. They were married in February of 1883 in Cimarron, at the small church on the east side of town. It was not a large wedding. Clara Whitfield was there, and Pedro and Lucia and their children, and Martha's brother-in-law Raymond, who came from the adjoining county with his wife and who shook Jasper's hand with a searching look, and then a nod that meant he had made his assessment and was satisfied. There were a few neighbors and acquaintances, the county clerk who had helped Martha with the land records and who brought his wife, and that was all. Martha wore a dress of dark blue wool because she was not going to wear white at 34 on her second marriage, and she looked, Clara told her beforehand with some emotion, exactly like herself, which was the best thing she could have said. The ceremony was short and plain, and the words meant everything because the two people saying them intended every word. When the minister said, "And do you, Jasper Kendrick, take this woman as your lawfully wedded wife?" Martha watched Jasper's face as he said, "I do," and she saw in it the same quality she had noticed in him from the beginning, the absolute unhurried certainty of a man who means what he says and does not say things he does not mean. She said her own vows with her eyes on his, and her voice steady and clear. They rode back to the Bristol ranch in a wagon with Clara and the Gutierrez family following behind, and Lucia had prepared a celebration dinner that was, by all accounts, extraordinary, and Pedro toasted them with a seriousness and a warmth that made Martha have to look at the ceiling for a moment. Raymond pulled her aside before he left and said, in his direct way, "Thomas would have liked him, Martha. He said it like it was a simple fact and not a gift, and it was the best thing he could have said." She walked him to his horse. "I know," she said, "I've known for a while." In the spring of 1883, they replanted the kitchen garden together, larger than it had been before, with a plan for it that they had drawn out on paper over the winter at the kitchen table with coffee at their elbows. Jasper had ideas about expanding the cattle operation, not dramatically, not in a way that would overextend them, but strategically, adding 10 or 15 head and improving the breeding stock. He talked about it the way Martha talked about the land, as something to be tended carefully and built over time, not rushed into and extracted from. She loved this about him. She loved his relationship to patience. She had known men who confused speed with competence, and she had never had patience for them. Jasper moved at the speed of things that would last. They rode out together in April to survey the north pasture, where the grass was coming back green and thick after the snow. The day was warm, and the sky was that particular New Mexico blue that had no equivalent anywhere else, and they rode side by side across the land that was both of theirs now, legally and in every other way, and Martha felt the 400 acres under her as something alive and continuous. "I want to add 30 head," she said, having revised her thinking. "If we move the winter grazing to the south slope and use the north pasture for the summer months," Jasper considered this. "That would work," he said. "We'd need another water source up on the north end, though, probably a cistern." "I know how to build a cistern," she said. "I know you do," he said. "I'll help." They built it that summer, working side by side in the July heat, and when they finished and the first water filled it, she turned to find him grinning at her with sweat on his face and mortar on his hands, and she kissed him right there in the field, and he held her there for a moment with his dirty hands careful at her waist. It was in the fall of 1883, 1 full year after he had first appeared at her gate without permission, that Martha told him she was expecting. She told him in the morning, before the work, standing in the kitchen with the yellow light coming through the window. She had known for 3 weeks and had spent those 3 weeks being quietly, carefully, ecstatically certain before saying anything, because she was not a woman who spoke before she was sure. Jasper stood very still for a moment. Then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in both his hands and looked at her, and his eyes were very bright. "Are you all right?" he said. "I am more than all right," she said. He held her for a long time. She felt his heartbeat against her cheek, fast and strong. "I know you said you tried before," he said quietly into her hair. "Yes," she said. "Are you frightened?" "A little," she said honestly, "but in the good direction." He drew back and looked at her, and there was so much in his face that she could not name all of it: love and wonder, and that particular quality of his careful steadiness applied to something that had, just now, made it impossible to be entirely steady. "I'm going to be a father," he said, as if hearing it for the first time, which he was. "You're going to be an extraordinary one," she said. "I have been watching you for a year, and I am completely confident about this." He laughed, the way he had laughed that first night in the kitchen in November, surprised, genuine, warm, and she laughed with him. Pedro and Lucia, when told, responded with such immediate and enthusiastic joy that it was slightly overwhelming. Lucia had 4 children of her own, and she had very strong views about pregnancy and childbirth, and she delivered them with authority and affection. And Martha accepted them with the same warmth with which they were given, understanding that Lucia's advice was an act of love. Clara Whitfield cried, which she claimed was dust in her eye, and then composed herself and announced that she was going to make a quilt and was not to be argued with. The winter of 1883 into 1884 was a good winter on the Bristol ranch. Not easy winters never were, but good. The cattle were healthy, the feed supply was adequate, the new cistern had performed as planned, and the house was warm and full of the specific warm fullness of 2 people who were happy together and knew it, and did not take it for granted. Martha grew larger and the work adjusted around her, not because she stopped working, but because the nature of the work shifted. She managed more and lifted less. Jasper took the heavier physical tasks without discussion, but also without assumption, and when she wanted to do something herself, he let her, watching with the careful attention of someone who was ready to help if asked, but was not going to assume she needed it. She appreciated this enormously. She had been afraid, in a small way she had not entirely admitted to herself, that marriage would mean the slow erosion of the independence she had worked so hard to build. What she found instead was that Jasper Kendrick understood with an almost uncanny accuracy the difference between support and supersession. He backed her. He did not replace her. And the ranch ran better for having 2 pairs of eyes on it, and better still for those 2 pairs of eyes seeing things differently, and talking about those differences at the kitchen table in the evenings. On a Thursday morning in March of 1884, after a night that was difficult in the ways that births in 1884 were often difficult, Martha delivered a son. He was healthy and loud, and had a considerable quantity of dark hair in his father's eyes, or what Martha judged would be his father's eyes once they settled into their permanent color. Jasper held him with both arms and stood in the bedroom doorway with the early morning light coming in and his face doing something entirely new, something that no tool or fence or problem or piece of land had ever made it do, and Martha watched from the bed with exhaustion and complete contentment. "What do you want to name him?" Jasper said, without looking away from the baby. Martha had thought about this for months. She had a list in the tin box with the important papers. She had also thought about Thomas and whether to use his name, and she had decided she would not, because this child was his own person and not a memorial, and she thought Thomas would have agreed. "Robert," she said. "For your grandfather if you want it." Jasper looked at her. His grandfather's name was Robert. She had learned this in the long winter conversations at the kitchen table, the patient accumulation of 2 people's histories and families and the names that mattered. "Robert Kendrick," he said. "Robert Thomas Kendrick," she said, "if that suits you." He came back to the bed and sat beside her and kissed her forehead and her temple, and then carefully lay the baby in her arms. And she held her son and felt the spring sun coming through the window and the weight of the morning, which was incalculable. "It suits me perfectly," he said. Robert Thomas Kendrick turned out to be a healthy, opinionated, and extremely energetic child who made his views on most matters known with clarity and volume from an early age. He was also, by general consensus, utterly charming, which everyone around him attributed to some mysterious third source, given that both his parents were, in their own ways, somewhat reserved. Pedro's children adored him. Clara Whitfield, who had no children of her own, became his unofficial aunt within his first month of life, and took this role with a seriousness and commitment that brought her to the Bristol Ranch practically every week. By the summer of 1884, the Bristol Ranch, which Jasper had suggested renaming the Kendrick Ranch and Martha had said they would keep the name because it had history, and he had agreed without argument, and this was the kind of decision they made together, was in the best shape it had been since before Thomas's death. The cattle herd was strong, the fences were in good repair, the north pasture was producing well, the cistern worked, the kitchen garden was larger than it had ever been, and the household was, by any measure that Martha Bristol had ever applied to anything, flourishing. The Darrow Land Company made one final attempt in August of 1884, this time in a letter addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Kendrick, which Martha noted was at least an improvement in courtesy over previous visits. The letter offered them a price that was very good. Jasper read it and handed it back to her without comment, waiting for her response. She wrote back on Bristol Ranch letterhead, in her clear, firm hand, that the property was not for sale. She thanked them for their continued interest. She wished them well in their other enterprises. She never heard from the Darrow Land Company again. That September of 1884, 2 years exactly from the morning Jasper Kendrick had appeared at her gate, Martha carried her coffee out to the yard in the early morning and stood in the same place she had stood on that first day, looking at the gate he had built. It was still solid, still true, the latch moving cleanly on its pivot, the rail as solid as the day he had set it. She heard the back door behind her, and he came out with his own coffee and Robert on his hip, the baby still in his nightclothes, and looking around at the morning world with the bright-eyed incomprehension and absolute delight that babies bring to everything. Jasper stood beside her. Robert reached for her and she took him and held him between them, and the three of them stood at the gate looking at the morning. "You know," she said, "I told myself I was not going to think about you after that first day." "How did that work out?" he said. She looked at him sideways. "Very poorly," she said. He was smiling, a real full smile, and she thought, not for the first time, that she had been wrong to keep that smile waiting as long as she had, though she also knew she had not been wrong. They had arrived here at exactly the speed they needed to, not a moment faster, and the solid ground of the thing they had built was partly built from that patience. "I was thinking," she said, about the Kellerman parcel to the north. It's changed hands twice since the Darrow Company acquired it, and I heard from Raymond that the current owner is having a difficult time with it." Jasper was listening. "If we expanded the north boundary," she said, "we would have access to the creek year-round and enough grazing for another 60 head. He looked at the mountains. She could see him running the calculations, the feed, the water, the labor, the capital required. "We would need another hand," he said. "Pedro has a nephew," she said. "He mentioned it last week." "That's very convenient timing," Jasper said. "I do like to have things in order before I bring them up," Martha said. He laughed. Robert, responding to the laugh, made an enthusiastic noise that had no specific meaning but expressed general satisfaction with the proceedings. Martha bounced him once and he made the same noise again. "We'd need to make sure the water rights are clean," Jasper said. "I'll go to the land office in Cimarron," Martha said. "Take Robert," he said. "Let him see the country. He's 7 months old. He has to start somewhere." She looked at her son, who was now deeply interested in the turquoise stone in her ring and grabbing for it with both hands. He had, she thought, his father's hands. long-fingered and deliberate. "We'll go next week," she said. "You can manage the property." "I always can," he said, and there was nothing in it but the simple truth of it. She handed Robert to him, and he took the baby with the ease of a man who had learned over 7 months the particular fluency of holding a child who trusted you completely. Robert immediately reached for Jasper's hat and grabbed the brim with both hands and pulled, and Jasper caught the hat before it went and held it out of reach, and the baby made a noise of focused displeasure, and Martha watched them and felt the year sitting around her like a good coat. 2 years. 2 years from the morning she had stood at this window with her coffee and watched a stranger fix what was broken without asking. She had not asked for this either. She had not asked for any of it, not the man at the gate, not the warmth that had built between them like a fire taking hold, not the son who was currently making another attempt on Jasper's hat, not the life that had grown up around her quiet refusal to stay only as small as her grief. But she had brought him coffee anyway. And from that single ungrand act, one woman, one mug, one cold morning, everything else had grown. In the winter of 1885, Martha found that she was expecting again, and she told Jasper the same way she had told him the first time, in the kitchen in the morning light, and he took her face in his hands and looked at her with the same bright eyes and the same careful love. And she felt, as she always did with him, that she was completely and specifically seen. Robert Kendrick turned 2 years old in March of 1886, walking and talking and running at full speed into everything in his path, with an enthusiasm that exhausted everyone around him, and was entirely endearing. His sister, Eleanor Ann Kendrick, arrived in April of 1885, small and observant, and possessed from the very beginning of a quality of quiet attention that Martha recognized, with a warmth that moved through her chest as her own. Clara Whitfield finished not one quilt but 3, one for each child born and one in advance for a future child she had decided to believe was coming, and she delivered them with the air of someone who had merely attended to a practical matter and did not require thanks, and Martha thanked her anyway, each time, holding the quilts that smelled like Clara's house and lavender, and the particular love of a woman who gives what she has. Pedro Gutierrez's nephew, whose name was Mateo, and who was 20 years old and extremely hardworking, joined the Bristol ranch operation in the fall of 1884 and proved himself within the first month to be exactly what he had been recommended as. By 1886, he had learned enough that Jasper could take 3 consecutive days away from the property for the first time since he had arrived, and they rode to Santa Fe together, Martha and Jasper, and stayed at a hotel with clean sheets and a real bathtub, and ate in a restaurant and walked through the plaza in the evenings while the mountains sat in the distance like something that had always been promised. Santa Fe in 1886 was a place of complicated life, Spanish and Anglo and native lives running alongside each other with varying degrees of friction and coexistence. They walked through the market on Saturday morning, where the Pueblo vendors sold pottery and blankets of extraordinary beauty and complexity. Martha stopped at a booth where an older woman was selling a series of deep blue-glazed bowls, and Jasper stood beside her while she chose one and paid for it with the unhurried pleasure of a woman who does not often buy beautiful things for herself and knows the value of it when she does. They talked that evening over dinner about what they had seen in the city, the land office expansion, the railroad that was changing the shape of commerce in the territory, the way the old Spanish architecture was being pressed on from every side by new construction that did not know its history. Martha had views on all of it. Jasper engaged with everyone. This was something she had never taken for granted about him. His genuine appetite for her thinking, the way he did not simply listen but responded, pushed back, revised, contributed, so that the conversation was built by both of them and was always better for having had 2 minds in it. They went back to the ranch at the end of 3 days carrying the blue bowl wrapped in cloth, and a book of maps that Jasper had found at a bookseller's shop, and a toy horse carved from pale wood that they had bought for Robert, and a small silver bracelet for Alina, who was too young to wear it but who would have it when she was older. They came home to the property in the late afternoon, and the light was the October light, amber and low, the mountains in their October purple, and Mateo had everything in order, and Robert ran out to meet them at the gate with a velocity that suggested he had been watching the road for some time, and Jasper caught him at full speed and lifted him, and the boy shrieked with delight. And Martha climbed down from the wagon and looked at the house and the barn and the gate and the land stretching out in every direction, and felt the word she had felt before, the one that was simple and factual: home. The Bristol Ranch, they had kept the name, would always keep the name. It was written on the gate post and on the deed and in the county records, and in the history of the land itself, ran well into the years that followed. The cattle herd reached its target size by 1887. The north pasture performed as Martha had calculated it would. Mateo became a permanent member of the operation and brought skill and reliability and a good humor that made the days lighter. Jasper Kendrick proved, over years of evidence, to be exactly the man he had appeared to be when he fixed a gate without permission on a September morning in 1882. Not a man without flaws, he was stubborn in his own ways, slower to ask for help than he should have been, inclined to push through tiredness when rest was the wiser choice. But a man without deception, which Martha valued above most things, and a man who grew alongside her rather than ahead of or behind her, which she had not known before Thomas to ask for, and had not known between Thomas and Jasper was possible to find. They had disagreements. A ranch of 400 acres and 2 adults with strong independent minds produced disagreements as a natural byproduct. They argued about the cattle contracts one spring, and about the south boundary fence one summer, and about whether Robert should be sent to school in Cimarron or taught at home for the first few years, which was a disagreement that went on across 2 months and 4 conversations, and resolved itself in a synthesis that was largely Martha's idea, but that incorporated 3 of Jasper's points, and this was how most of their disagreements resolved. Not with one winner and one loser, but with something better than either starting position. Robert went to school in Cimarron at 7, and Alina at 6, and they both came home on school holidays with books and questions, and the particular energy of children whose minds were being used, and who wanted to use them more. Jasper read to them in the evenings when the work was done, sitting with one child on each knee, and a book open across both of them, his voice steady and warm, and Martha would sit across the room with her accounts or her sewing, and listen to the sound of him, and feel the day settle around her like water finding its level. There was a third child, a boy they named Thomas William Kendrick. She had come to feel, by 1888, that she could honor Thomas without grief taking over from joy, and he arrived in the summer with the same health and volume as his older brother, and was, from the beginning, utterly unlike Robert in disposition, slow and dreamy where Robert was quick and direct, interested in quiet things where Robert was interested in everything at once. Martha loved both qualities in equal and specific measure. The years of the late 1880s brought changes to New Mexico territory that were visible from the Bristol Ranch, the way weather is visible from a high ridge, the railroad reaching further, the towns growing, the old open range giving way to fenced operations on every side, the territory moving toward the statehood it would reach in 1912, though that was still decades away. Martha and Jasper watched these changes with the same careful attention they gave to everything on the property, seeing what was coming and adjusting for it, keeping the operation sound and forward-looking. The Darrow Land Company dissolved in 1887, its consolidation strategy having overextended itself. Martha read about it in the Cimarron paper and set the paper down on the kitchen table and said nothing for a moment and then got up to start supper. "Good news," Jasper said from where he was reviewing the feed accounts. "The Darrow Land Company is gone," she said. He looked up. A brief silence. "How do you feel about that?" he said. She thought about it. "Like the work was worth doing," she said. "Like a thing that needed to hold held." He smiled at her. She went back to making supper. He went back to the accounts. In the next room, Eleanor was reading to Thomas, her voice small and clear, reading words by lamplight while the October evening settled over the land outside. By 1889, the Bristol ranch employed Mateo year-round and 2 additional hands seasonally, and the operation had a reputation in the county for fair dealing and sound stock. Jasper had become known among the neighboring ranchers as someone worth consulting on cattle health and grazing management, and Martha had been twice asked by the county assessor's office to help resolve boundary disputes between neighboring properties given her evident expertise with survey records, which she had done because the work was interesting, and because she believed in accurate records as a matter of principle. On the evening of their 5th wedding anniversary, February of 1888, they were sitting on the porch in spite of the cold, wrapped in coats and the thick quilt Clara had made, because the sky was clear and the stars were extraordinary, and Jasper had suggested it and Martha had agreed without argument, which was how she showed him she wanted the same thing he wanted. "I want to tell you something," Jasper said. "You say that as though it might be alarming," she said. "It's not alarming," he said. "It's just something I want to say." He looked at the stars. "When I fixed your gate, I had been on the road for 6 months and I had no particular plan, and I was genuinely not sure what I was looking for. I don't know what made me stop there and not somewhere else. I can't account for it." "The gate was dragging," Martha said. "There were other gates in the county," he said. "There were other things I could have fixed." He looked at her. "I stopped there because something in me knew before I knew it that it was where I needed to be." Martha looked at the mountains, at the stars, at the dark shape of the land she knew better than her own hands. "I was not going to bring you that second cup," she said. "I suspected that at the time," he said. "I poured it before I made any decision about it," she said. "My hands did it while I was still telling myself I wasn't going to." He took her hand. It was a cold night and their hands were both cold and they held on anyway. "I'm glad your hands were smarter than your head," he said. "They usually are," she said, which was not entirely true but was true in this particular instance, and she was prepared to admit it. The fire was in the parlor behind them, and the children were in bed, and the horses were in the barn, and the land was all around them. 400 acres and the north parcel they had added, and the life they had built on it year by year, season by season, decision by decision, argument by argument, harvest by harvest, the small and large accumulations of a life built together with full attention. She leaned into him and he put his arm around her and the quilt pulled around them both. And they sat like that under the stars while the night moved over the mountains and the coyotes called out on the mesa and the ranch breathed around them in the cold. A widow who had never asked for company and a cowboy who had fixed her gate without permission. She had brought him coffee anyway. That was all it had taken. That and everything that followed, the work, the patience, the truth-telling, the arguments and the resolutions, the children and the land and the long evenings and the coffee always. The coffee was always there, 2 mugs every morning on the fence post and then on the porch and then at the kitchen table. The small ceremony of it, the offering and the receiving, the going on of it day after day, until it was not an offering any more but simply a fact of the world, as fixed and reliable as the mountains, as the stars, as the gate that had been broken and was now, and had been for years, absolutely sound.